Recording now. And can you folks see my agenda screen?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay. So on that note, if you are just joining us and want to look at some of our previous recordings, I will put that in the chat. There is a couple housekeeping items that I will also just cover right away. So we've kind of had more governance-oriented discussions for the last two sessions, and one of them was just around material access. So while we're talking about reviewing past recordings, Mike, darling that he is, has been able to port over all of our materials from the previous OwnCloud into the folder on InfoScribe that we'll have kind of moving forward. So if similarly you want to start bookmarking where you can find maybe past meeting deck uploads or special topics materials like presentations like we've had on the bake syntax from FHIR, those are now in that InfoScribe page. We haven't gone through and ensured we have full coverage of everything, but we've been able to get, I think, the majority of it ported over. So if you're looking for recordings, you can go to the YouTube. That's the first one. If you're looking for materials or want to know where things will be loaded moving forward, if we do have a special topics, that is the document folder structure that we have in the second link in the chat. For today, there's a couple, I don't know, they're kind of maybe a little bit housekeeping items, but we do want to make sure that we have a chat with the kind of profiling stream as well around project URLs. And then I know I was chatting with peers a little bit earlier in the month around one of the topics that he had raised through the community issue log. And so I've identified that as one of our first starting points. So typically when we are meeting on the profiling stream, one of the first things that we go to is any of the community issue log items that like have been identified and need triaging. And then typically after that, we go through and say, okay, if it has a decision made, you know, do we want to start working through and actually making the changes on the call together? So I've got one of those as a first item up, and then there's a couple others that that came out of past reviews that we did recently as a community against the CA core, is that we had said we're going to make sure to get it into our backlog and to get it part of the consideration for the discussion of the profiling stream. So I've got a few of those added in, and then I've got one that might also kind of be in that space, but wasn't exactly core adjacent. It's kind of a hefty schedule, so I put value set stubs as a potential topic. But before we attempt to get there, or before we start tackling any of the issue log items and making decisions on them, were there other things that folks expected on the agenda for today's profiling call that you want to make sure have a place? All right. Okay, so the first item shouldn't be too long. We had a discussion in last week's Friday call. I know we've got a lot of overlap between our governance and our profiling folks, but we wanted to make sure that we brought kind of some of that discussion to the space as well, made sure that folks were kind of comfortable with it. One of the items that we've been looking at as part of our kind of preparation of our own materials, trying to get them ready for not just ballot, but also like how do we expose and make it clear to the community where it fits in our overall ecosystem, has been, you know, doing a lot of the guide and the profile and the canonical cleanups that we've been kind of going through over the last 6 months. And we had kind of really one outstanding piece that we've been kind of putting off because we knew that like there are some folks that have hyperlinked to our FHIR project page. And so we wanted to make sure that before we made any changes, there was a, you know, long runway for folks to prepare for it. It's maybe less of a technical impact, but it's something we want to socialize nonetheless. So last week at the governance call, we were chatting through like, you know, do we want to refine our FHIR project URL, which this is the URL today. So this would be like how you would find our profiles if you were kind of manually linking to them instead of just looking for the project in the FHIR Canadian Fire Registry. And if we do want to change, what should we change it to kind of get that greater clarity that we're looking for? So the one that was kind of put forward as the preferred option that we said we'd socialize with the profiling stream as well is just simplifying it. So removing core from the end, but also like it's a FHIR project, so not necessarily restating FHIR and shortening it a bit. So this is kind of the option that was put forward as preferred. We haven't changed it yet. We wanted to make sure we gave folks a couple weeks heads up, and we gave, you know, the ability, folks on the profiling stream were like, nope, this looks bad, to bring that back to governance as well. So kind of with that in mind, anything surprising about that? Any concerns with like the more simplified URL for the project that's being put forward?
And we should be clear, this is for the project URL, not the canonical URL.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll just actually just open it up because I think I have it. So you guys can actually see, I think it's back here. So when we go to the Canadian baseline, it's this project. Whereas the profiles themselves don't have this as the URL, they have a different canonical URL. So this is the one that we discussed changing, and that Ken had alerted us last time that there is an easy way to actually modify the URL without having to port the guide, which is brilliant. We're happy about that. And so it's kind of like the last step in just aligning to what we have everywhere else in terms of the title and the descriptions and linking it to how we have it rendered in the CI build. So nice little spring cleaning item. So with that in mind, because we did say we'll bring it to the profiling stream, let folks kind of react to it. Any concerns with like the way that it's structured, with our move towards a more simplified option? And you know, if we were to kind of make them port over in the next 2 to 3 weeks to give folks a little bit of a heads up on the forums ahead of time, any concerns with that approach? All right, I didn't think there would be, but you know, due diligence and all. All right, so part of our process is going to be just to make sure that we try to exhaust every avenue to let folks know. So we'll put out a forum post indicating that we will be moving towards the simplified, but basically all of the project and the project history, all the profiles, they're still going to be there. It's just how do you get there faster? That will change. With that housekeeping item kind of out the way, I think we could probably dig a little bit more into the profiling content portion of the call. So there were a few items that were identified as part of the review of the CA Core 0.1 profiles. And one of them was around a structure that we have in place today for Canadian baseline that at the time was replicated in the core. And when we started to review it and discuss that it had some differences in how we're seeing some of the more recent guides like International Patient Access socialize this extension. The feedback that we gave as a community to the core and said we would take back to review on like against the baseline as well was to expand out the current representation of the invariant in the baseline today. So I will pull that up so we can look at it together.
Yeah, the baseline today doesn't currently include text, from my understanding.
Let's see, and I know it doesn't include DAR, I don't think so. Let's take
it does allow for DAR in the patient at least, or a provider at least.
And that might be because we went through like an invariant refinement based off of some of the items that BC had brought up about refining the invariants for provider names, but didn't go through the step of actually doing that for patient as well.
Yeah.
So when I'm looking at patient, what we're effectively reacting to is this invariant. So you can see I'm in this kind of hybridized view. I'll zoom in a little, folks. So you see this I here, that means that there's been an invariant that this profile applies. So beyond the invariants that are naturally present in the base specification to make sure that like, you don't just give us a name and don't give anything else like that, like this ELE one from the base spec that we see on the right. The baseline has an additional rule that says patient name given, patient name family, or both shall be present. Which means like, and the way that it's applied here is to say that like, if you populate this, then there is this secondary expectation that you're going to give me family or given. And to Lorraine's point, doesn't support text, doesn't support DAR. So it's possible, and I can't remember if
TA core allowed text.
yeah, it did. Yeah. And
Mhm.
so going back to your statement, which is to say that like, if we look at this and we say, do we want to just allow given, family, and text and not include DAR? That's an option. It's more restrictive than I think what we put forward in the recommendation to the core, which was to allow for given, family, text, or DAR. So that's part of the reason why we're bringing it up, which is to say that like we had some of these discussions as part of those dispositioning sessions, but we know that like not everybody who's part of the profiling calls will have attended those, and therefore like we want to make sure that we have this chance to evaluate that as a rule for ourselves. If it's something that we still feel confident and kind of agree makes sense. So really I can show up kind of, maybe we can pull up the example for, let me pull it up in IPA and the core. So the modeling that we had looked at when we were doing our community review of the core patient profile was an invariant that is present here. And this is just the like human description, right? We can look at the FHIR path if folks want to take a look at it, but it's given, family, name, text, or data absent reason shall be present. So in that sense, like, I think they're both shalls. Let's take a look. But this would be considered stricter than what we're looking at over here if we look at them side by side. So before we dig into like the FHIR path or anything like that, what are folks' immediate reactions? Do we like
I actually think it's looser, not stricter.
this one, the invariant we have on the baseline?
The invariant we have in the baseline is stricter than what's in
Yes.
IPA.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm certainly supportive of adding data absent reason, and I could be convinced about name.txt. That would be discussion.
So I have an issue on this already. Maybe we can start actually talking through the case for DAR, like if you've got a really clear, this is why we want to do it, as well as maybe exploring the text so that we can work towards a decision on it. All right, so like all of the items that we talk through on the calls, we try our best to get everything documented and decisioned, and now recently, in the last few months, voted on, so that we have a really clear log of, for any of our co-editors to go through and apply the things and know exactly what we've made some agreements on. So in terms of our options, so it's 419, we can keep it as is if folks like it and we're okay with being potentially stricter than the core and potentially stricter than IPA. We can look at adding in and having it be name given, name family, or DAR, or we could look at aligning and saying, we think there's a reasonable case in the base for it to be name given, name family, name text, or DAR.
Well, so if we look at what IPA has, I mean, basically what it's saying is if you have a name, you need to have a name. Like text or given or family or DAR, that's really loose. I mean, basically it says you can't just have a name that's a title.
Yeah.
So if we were to relax it to that point, is there any value in it? Or maybe you could take a look at the other, or look at it from the other side and say, is there any harm in it? It's so loose that it's not really going to constrain what goes in there.
Yeah, and
Let's take a
name
look
is
at
already,
what's, yep, go ahead.
name's already 0 to star.
Yeah.
So in the case of a patient that's unidentified in the ER, for example, you don't have to provide the name.
And so, like, when we're talking about these elements, given, family, text, these are all components of this, essentially this like human name data type. So it's to say that if you're going to give me something, you can't just give me use. If you're going to give me something, you can't just give me a prefix. And that's kind of a silly example because we, you know, for name, it's hard to imagine scenarios where that might happen, but that is the intent for allowing for, you know, essentially one of these three, or you have to tell me why you don't have this thing if you're going to supply me something else, but not give me one of those three.
I'm lost on why we would even allow a data absent reason. I mean, every patient has a name.
No, every patient may have a name, but it may not be known to the system that's logging it.
And data absent reason can be used to provide anonymous names.
Yeah,
or
so
to suppress a
can,
name.
Yeah, it can mask a name, for instance. But I mean, so the big difference between what's in core right now and what's in our material is that core is allowing text, which is, you know, basically a free form definition of the names. You can provide just the text in core and not provide either family or given. And we're saying you need at least one of the two between family or given.
Yep. And I think at the time when I'd have to go back through our logs, but at the time when we discussed it, because we had said, you know, effectively the baseline community said, we think that core, which had copied the baseline's approach, should look at relaxing this further and aligning to IPA. The case was that there might be scenarios where the name that is being conveyed in particular and the way it's being captured, the originating system wants to be able to convey it as its entire string. And that I think the cases that were provided were like when you have what is it, like not multiple middle names, but like the conventional way of capturing it in structured fields may not be appropriate in that given instance. So that was at least what was discussed historically. But again, this is why we bring it back, which is to say that you know, assess.
So the question, yeah. So the question is, if we have a name, do we want to allow it to be just the text representation and not anything else?
Are there cases where we might need to support that for historical data, data coming in from outside sources?
I don't know. That's why I said I could be convinced about, you know, text as an option there.
Yeah.
So in your own implementations, folks that are on the call, are there cases where either in your profiles or what you've seen in the data when you are starting to prepare for it in FHIR, where your specific, you know, your instances, you need to have a little bit of flexibility to account for just having that string for patient is the context we're talking about it right now.
Well, and the question is because the core has made the looser decision, do we want the baseline to be more constrained than the core if we're looking at the dependency hierarchy.
So
I
my
don't-
first, oh, go ahead, Elliot.
I would say no.
Correct.
I will point out, quite frankly, the reason it was loosened in the core was because community review items from the baseline identified it should be loosened. So that's important context here.
Oh,
Mhm.
well then.
Well, then maybe we should be loosening it to be consistent.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, the other way of looking at it is if something is changed or our understanding of the material has changed, we also have the opportunity to say, you know what? We chewed on this for a little bit and we have new information. And so to change the feedback or to provide new feedback to the core as well, if we feel reasonably solid about, we think it should be this moving forward. Maybe, let me just actually pull up the. Would it
Because
be
I think
helpful to
when
pull
we
up the
made,
disposition?
yeah, when we made the decision originally to require at least family or given, that was before the core even existed.
Yeah. Yes, I just found it a second ago. It's not that one. I think it was Sheets, Google Sheets that we used. Okay. All right, so this was the original comment that we provided in our community review. Review the invariant that was in CA baseline 1.1.6 on name and identified differences in strength of target. So when we reviewed it against IPA. So the idea was that IPA allows for this. Let's see, differences in strength. I wonder if this
And
is
IPS is slightly different.
An IPS is given family or text. We're recommending follow the approach for guides like IPA, enforcing a shall statement on these or allow for DAR.
I'm okay with making the baseline align with that. It is looser than we originally decided, so I'm interested in other people's opinion.
Yeah, it just seems like if you don't have a first name and you have a last name, then you have a name. There's no reason for a DAR, but I mean, is it just the case where there is some confusion about whether this is a first name or a last name, so you don't know how to enter it, and so you would just use text? Like, I don't really understand the actual situation where you would need text where first or last name wouldn't be appropriate.
I guess the question is if you have data coming from a connected system that only has the name in the text representation, and you don't want to try to parse it to figure out which is given and which is family, et cetera. That would be the use case that I could think of.
Yeah.
I think there was something in the base spec about it too. I'm just looking. So when we look at the details,
Lincoln Anderson. Which is which?
Mm-hmm.
well, it looks like, okay, so it's not coming from the base spec. I do have to go back through my recording, get the original one, but so we had the case for DAR and we were working on the case for text. Gotta love a refresh. And our case for text that we were describing was where a system does not know whether the name that was recorded should be populated in given or family.
Yeah, well, you've got a name and the parsing rules aren't necessarily clear, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, languages that do support some of these structures are very clear about how you manage things like van der Zijl, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Do we think that there are cons that we have to consider before thinking about which of the options that we would want to pursue for either of these from a base perspective?
I'm not sure if this is a con or not, but I'm really, like Elliot, I'm uncomfortable with having the base more constrained than core.
So, sorry, so we want to avoid having baseline more constrained than core, but recognize that like our findings could also result in feedback.
Yeah, I mean, we could ask core to change in order to resolve that mismatch, but
Are there cases where like indigenous names wouldn't follow the pattern of given or family? Like,
depending, some systems might put it all in family or all in given. There's all sorts of weirdities around the world on names.
Yeah.
There are some cultures, I think in Australia, I'm not sure exactly where the name changes based on where you live.
So with what we know and have discussed today, do people feel strongly about one of these options? I said there were 3, but technically there were 4 permutations. So this would be aligning to, sorry, go ahead. Was there something there? All right, this would be aligning to, I'm just gonna comment so I don't lose it again. The kind of what is put forward in core today based off of the feedback. This should be a, like we could do an either or. Sounds like folks feel really good about DAR, so there's probably not a only allow for text. In my mind, like if we're trying to be a baseline, like I'm more keen to go with the like this looser one, because while it's nominal, like we get some value, and then should there be further need to constrain it, to put that forward in the core. Like if we do believe that folks have either context, like use case reasons for using text or legacy reasons for using text, I think that that's something that like a base acknowledges about its country's ecosystem. But then if the desire is, hey, let's make sure our systems have ways of structuring and parsing this information, and we determine that that's feedback we want to put to the core, to tighten it there.
And an implementation guide, for instance, say a client registry implementation guide, could tighten it up more because they have more tighter expectations.
So
The only part there that I have the issue is the DAR part, because I know from our processes you'll never have no name. I mean, even if somebody comes in unidentified, they'll give them a Jane Doe or John Doe kind of thing.
You don't
Yeah.
have to use DAR.
Yeah. But do you use DAR for masking?
Or does someone use DAR for masking? Because it's like,
Yes.
even if you don't use it in Alberta, if you used it in Saskatchewan, this would ensure that the baseline doesn't block your ability to do that.
Yeah, I do think there's situations where we want to de-identify and mask data, even if we have the rest. Now, in that case, you could potentially just say, well, don't provide a name at all. But
More likely you just give a obfuscated name. That really should have something to refer to them by other than the real name. But
I mean, if we map back over to practitioner, the reasons that BC, the use case that BC used DAR on practitioner was in situations where they're only talking about them by their identifier and they're not providing names. And I don't know if if there's a parallel use case on patient for that or not, but that's where we went to using DAR and practitioners' names.
yes, the
Oh,
issue
is this,
on the client side or patient side is that it's one of those things to keep established identity with the provider. It's not always so important to identify who it was. In a lot of cases, like, well, I went to a doctor and they did this, but you don't remember which doctor. On the other hand, you need to know which patient you're dealing with.
But unequivocally, DAR is used for masking. So like, we know that it's a use case. We know it will show up. Even if it's not like commonly going to populate in instances, it will be something that happens.
Is there anything unique about Canadian names that would drive this to be different from IPA?
I don't think so, because I think we have names from all over the world in our systems. I'd be willing to make a motion that we adopt the invariant that's specified by IPA, and let people then throw stones at that. Granted, that's not a very constrained invariant, but it's there.
Does anyone want to second that motion? Did I capture it correctly? Actually, first I should ask Lorraine, is that?
Maybe let's make it as currently specified, just because.
Yep. So I've got you as a motioner. Is there anyone that would want to second that?
Elliot?
Would we need further discussion?
How about if we actually say what it is?
Sure, I'm happy with that. We can copy that over.
Okay, so just for confirmation, it's given family text or DAR. I'll just confirm that very quickly.
To be pedantic, it's given or family or text, parentheses, or DAR.
Yeah. That look like what you're trying to motion?
Yeah.
All right, Elliot, do you need me to recall a second? Or do you still second?
I still second. I take that as a friendly amendment.
All right. Is there further discussion that's required? All right, I think that's 15-0. Oh, sorry, actually, hold on. Is there no further discussion required? Are there any abstentions? Like, don't have an opinion on this, haven't been listening, don't want to be counted towards it. Any objections? All right, I think that's 1500. All right, so we will, ooh, that's kind of ugly. Mark that down as the change. And I just have to modify this one real quickly to include this. And it was this before. All right. With that in mind, before we move on to the other one, I know that we have another one from the peers you had raised on diagnostic report. And just in respect to having asked you to make sure that you could be on this call, I want to make sure that we have time to cover it.
Yeah, I can speak to that really quickly. And apologies if this sounds funny because I'm on my phone because my Zoom is acting up. But in BC with the P-list, we have a use case where when a diagnostic report comes in, it can have 0 results on it because BC does this weird thing where it sends 2 reports, one that is partial before fulfillment has taken place, but it's not really a request. It's not an order, but and then multiple reports that come in with the results until the report is final. So in the CA baseline diagnostic report, result has a cardinality of 1 too many. So that doesn't really work to support that requirement for having a diagnostic report for labs with 0 results. So currently, in the draft implementation guide that I'm writing, I've just used the base resource for diagnostic report rather than the CA baseline, but I prefer to use the CA baseline if it was loose.
And so I think kind of our options are, one, I always think as a baseline kind of confirmation understanding is like, this is always the intent of us having a minimum 1 of the slice, because since doing a lot of the work on the profiling, we originally had some conditionality in place with their slicing to say, if you will support this, then you should at least support this, which we have since learned is does not uphold in terms of like that as a conformance expectation. And so if we still feel like, no, the intent of this is to enforce that there is a result for this profile, which I mean, viably is for results reporting, then we have to decide, like, do we open up this to allow for results, use cases where results maybe haven't been finalized and provided yet, so that we have better coverage of the folks that this is covered by, or maintain it and say, okay, there are going to be some scenarios where this profile isn't relevant given its scope. Are there other options that folks kind of see as things for us to explore here?
Well, yeah, there's another option that the baseline is kept the way it is, which for my use case is kind of draconian, and then we're unable to use the baseline, so we decide to just support the set of messages where there are results, and then we stop using that kind of ORM and ORU pattern, which is really tied to the V2 specification, but I can't see that actually working.
So you're saying that for practical purposes, if we decide to leave the baseline requiring at least 1 result, then you just won't be able to conform to the baseline. You'll have to inherit directly from the core international spec.
Yeah, that's what we're currently planning to do if the baseline isn't loosened. But I'm using the baseline for other resources dependencies. I mean, for what it's worth, this is for all BC labs. The PLIS is the central repository here. So it's it's a pretty big application.
So, well, yeah, and it's the original PLIS is pretty heavily dependent on V3 in terms of the results.
Is there a must support on that? Is it that during the event that there isn't a result, but some point later in the event there will be, and therefore like the must support carries, or is the problem with both the must support and the minimum of one? Is it that result will never be important in that scenario?
I'm not sure I understand. I mean, the result will be there in this scenario, just not in the initial message.
Okay.
There certainly is not an intent to permanently have a diagnostic report that has no results on it.
Is there a need to do something conforming to the profile even when there isn't a result? Like, you can send a diagnostic report without meeting this profile if you don't have a result. Is that an option?
Just
Um,
sorry, just a question. And when we're looking at result, the result says 0 to many, and then the slices in it have 1 to whatever.
Yeah, that's true.
So you don't actually have to have any from that, the way I understand what that's saying.
That's the way I understand it, but I
I-
think the actual cardinality for the result there is 1 too many, just because it has a required slice for lab result. And it's I kind of argued this back and forth with myself. If you don't have any lab results, do you have 0 lab results, or do you have absent 1 lab result, you know? I guess the thing is,
Because on my understanding, the result section there is the parent of the slices under it, right? And if you don't have any, that still fits that 0 to whatever.
Yeah, we may want to double check what
So I
the
mean,
current
Doesn't-
implementation guide
Yeah,
publisher does.
it doesn't
and that's-
actually allow that anymore.
yes,
Which is
slicing
disappointing.
slicing is confusing at the best of times, and I think it does force you to. It is like a requirement at the top level.
And validation tools will generally throw a warning in nowadays when you have a top level 0 to many and like a 1 to many on the lower level.
yeah, that's what I would expect is like either you've got to change that result to 1 to
Yeah.
whatever, or change lab result to 0 to whatever.
Yeah.
And so
I want
for
to-
our purposes of evaluating what's here, what I would say is while it's rendering from this, from a conformance perspective, a validation tool would say, I'm expecting at least 1 result, even though you're not seeing it in the differential, based on like what we know now about those minimum cardinalities at slices being enforced upwards. So with that in play, and acknowledging that was a pattern we used to have, and that might very much well be the reason we have this here. Does it mean that our underlying reasoning is still sympathetic to the case that Piers is bringing up, which is to say that like we don't expect to meet the expectation of the profile that you always have to have a result, and that instead we've just, the way that we're modeling that intent doesn't align to our underlying expectation.
I want to add that I believe in Ontario for OLIS, because it's also mapped from V2, has a similar situation. So I'm looking at the OLIS specification right now, and they also have result 0 to many instead of 1 to many.
The other question I would have in terms of our slice is diagnostic report. Granted, we mostly use it in the lab space, but could we have a diagnostic report whose result is a diagnostic imaging specification, for instance? Like, is it always a lab result?
Yeah, this was an issue I brought up several years ago. and it seems that there's a fair amount here in other places as well that's lab specific. And I'm just willing to accept that this is a poorly named profile. And that it is a lab diagnostic report rather than a general one.
Which is okay to accept that until we actually want a general diagnostic report.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a lot of things within the baseline specification for diagnostic report which are added to categorize this instance of diagnostic report as being for laboratories. Like there's a category code, lab result, lab order.
Yes,
Why,
but I mean,
why add that if it's implied and it's just not a very good name for the report? Like I think diagnostic report does intend to include imaging as well. I don't know that you would ever mix the two together, but
yes, but you
that
could
was
have,
my-
well, you can actually, putting my orders and observations co-chair hat on here.
Yeah.
You can mix the two, but generally they're separate, but they're still diagnostic report resources, which is why OO ended up going through this, the structure about how when you have a report that needs to have specific sections, like an anatomic pathology report, why we had to deal with sections and compositions and things and put that structure in, because diagnostic report is intended to cover all of those use cases.
Right.
Now in this case, we might want just a lab diagnostic report, and that might be what we want, but the base resource is much broader than that.
Can I, just for the purposes of making sure that we touch on this, but also starting to work through, I think the initial question, just put review for consideration. We'll put this as a ticket. We will discuss it. Of scoping on of current scoping to Just Labs.
But if we go back to just like FHIR's request to be narrower, from what I heard, and I suspect, like, I don't know the other provincial systems, but they're either still using V2 and maybe thinking about FHIR or not there yet. That use case of providing the structure of a report that's then going to be filled in with results as they're available, I think is a generally applicable use case, particularly since most of us in the lab space are coming from V2.
Yes, I would agree with that.
So the result of that, I think that we're suggesting that for now, we don't provide a minimum cardinality of 1 on the lab results slice. Because what that's saying right now is results is already 0 to star. But it's saying if we provide a result, then we have to have a lab result within it. And I don't think that's what we want to say.
I'm going to post that as a motion.
Sure. To loosen the minimum cardinality of the lab results slice to 0.
All right. Yeah, I'll just say 0 because that's all right. Does that look right? Fully in case what you're looking to see happen. I'll zoom in a little. Of the lab results slice to 0.
Yeah.
Piers, does that meet your use case?
I believe that does. I mean, that's all I'm really looking for is, yes, they're lab results, and yes, it's possible that there are 0 of them. And that encapsulates that.
Well, I mean, we already had, you could have 0 results because result was always 0 to star.
Yeah.
It's just how do you interpret the requirement for the slice inside of it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think the latest IG publisher takes the sum of the minimum cardinalities and makes that the minimum cardinality for the element.
Yeah, like it kind of slices up.
Yeah, so lab results a minimum cardinality of 1, defaults a minimum cardinality of 0. Therefore, the minimum cardinality of result is 1. I think that's what the latest publisher does.
Yeah, that's my experience, and I'm using not the latest, but pretty close.
So Elliot, you're thinking that this change will have the desired impact that we're hoping to see.
Yeah, I think effectively, even though result says 0 right now, if you were to run it through a validator, I don't know that you could actually have a valid result or a valid report without a lab result.
Yes, which would mean that on this profile, you couldn't use it with another kind of result.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So I heard Lorraine as a motioner. Is there anyone who wants a second as currently described?
I'll second.
Okay. Do we feel like we need further discussion, at least on this item or this proposal? Is there anyone who wants to abstain? Is there anyone who wants to object? All right. That will carry for the results one. We don't have a ton of time. There's a second piece of this, and I should have separated it out, but specimen collection.
Yeah.
collector.
So
Do you think
we're
it's something we
using,
can, yeah, go ahead.
I can describe this really quickly, at least for context. We're using specimen collection collector as the collecting facility. So the location where the specimen was collected. The way that I found to do that is there isn't an organization directly associated with specimen collection collector, but there is a practitioner role. So I add the practitioner role, but there isn't an organization available within practitioner role within the CA baseline because it just connects to practitioner. I may be missing some subtlety in there. And that's the specific case. Elsewhere, I'm using practitioner role as a proxy for it's either a practitioner or it might be an organization or it might be a practitioner at an organization. I'm sure that's not the correct way to use practitioner role, but I don't see any way to manage that other than the way practitioner role in the base specification works, where it can have one or the other or both. But specifically for specimen collection collector, I don't see a way to represent that as an organization currently within the CA baseline.
And that, I believe, is due to a FHIR-based constraint. So we don't profile for specimen. It's not part of what we've attached here.
Right.
And so what I was looking just to see, so here's the like practitioner role being kind of your R4 options. I was trying to see if it's been expanded into R5. Looks like no, they've got patient-related person, but I'm guessing they're recommending like organization to be traversed through practitioner role.
Yeah, which makes sense, I think. And I don't really understand why when I look at practitioner role in the CA baseline that it is practitioner but not organization, because it seems like that's pretty fundamental to what practitioner role is. But I know we're running short on time here, so that's probably a lengthier discussion.
Well, if we look at the base spec, you can't have organization. The base spec doesn't permit organization.
I think the second point that Piers was making is when we do have a practitioner role profile, like here, we have previously removed constraints enforcing organization be present and removed our profiling target for organization. because
Okay.
of,
Did we actually remove it from the profiles in terms of not allowing? Because I know BC uses
we're not.
organization on practitioner role.
We're not prohibiting it, we're just not doing any profiling of it.
Okay,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
so yeah, that's fine. So it's there. You can use
Okay,
it.
in that case, I don't have any concerns other than I have a need to do a thing that seems more general purpose than just my use case. But
I think we might want to raise a ticket with international on specimen.collector to allow it to be an organization.
that would make a lot of sense. I would be very happy with that, and then I can continue doing what I'm doing with practitioner role elsewhere and talk about that some other time. But
Would you like to raise that change request?
me personally,
Sure,
if somebody could walk me through how to do that, I'd be happy to do that, yeah.
sure. Okay, we can talk offline.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
all right, so for a ticket into the base spec, so effectively, like, it's good to have that use case into the consideration moving forward. And for right now, in terms of the constraints that the baseline puts forward, like, you're not seeing anything beyond just the underlying boundaries of FHIR that's preventing you from, like, traversing organization this way, right?
No. And from the point of view of actually expressing what I'm trying to express, which is a collection facility, it would make a lot more sense to just support organization at the specimen collector property.
And you go to the specimen collection site?
Yeah, but you definitely can go via practitioner role to organization. And like in BC, as we're modeling facilities as organizations, then that makes sense.
Yeah.
So am I correctly stating, like, so we know that the change, if it occurs through the base specification level, like, there's a case for it, but in terms of, like, changes that you're asking then from the CA baseline at this point in time, you're not seeing anything that you would say this needs to change within constraints we've applied?
No, I agree with that.
Is there anything else on this ticket that needs to be discussed for next time, or can I mark it as a whole ready for application for the change that we put up top?
That works for me. I mean, I don't even know if the details for specimen collector are necessary, but as long as it's obvious that that's not the actual ask, that the ask is the content above, then I'm very happy with this. Sorry, there's fire alarms going off now.
How punny. Okay, so I'll mark this one. I'll make it, wow, I'll have to format a little bit better. So this one is now an action item. So anyone who's out there that is doing some community editing, I will triage this one upwards so that folks know it is ready for application. I'll do the same for the patient name one. So with that, I think, adjourn us. The recording will be up a little bit later today, and I think we'll start our next profiling call. I think we have a couple more items for decisioning on, and then maybe we'll apply some of the changes that we've discussed today if they haven't been done so already 2 weeks from now. And glad to see Piers and Lorraine, you guys are connecting around improvements to the base spec.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Do you want to hold on and we can walk through that now?
Sure.
Or Lorraine? Still here? Yeah, you are.
I was just about to make lunch, but
Okay.
if you want to
All right.
walk through it now, it's possible.
Well, if you
we can probably manage that offline. I can just send you an email and we can go from there.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Okay. All right. Thanks,
Okay.
folks.
thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.